Well, it's so hard to know where to stop,
These
where
out
to
of
start.
the way? Oh no, he's connected to these.
You're okay. It's okay.
It all started September 1, 1939. I was supposed to have my bar mitzvah. Somewhere in the middle of September. I am born on September 7th, but it never obviously happened. I got my bar mitzvah finally at the age of 60. In the beginning, my father decided immediately, as the war broke out, to run into the interior of Poland, as we were closer to the German border. And a day later, the Germans overtook us, and we had a very little incident. When we were spending the night in a little village, neighbors came in running, telling us that the Germans are already in the village, and they're going from house to house and looking for anybody with arms. My father got white because he had his gun with him. Mother saved the day by grabbing the gun, putting it under the arm, running to the back of the house to the well that they had, no city water, and she bent over the well, opened up the arm, and the gun fell in. About 10 minutes later or less, the Germans came in, searched us, searched everything, didn't find, and left for the next house. Well, we came back to town. There was no use running further. And the first thing that met us is the knowledge that one of my young cousins was shot during the time when the Germans occupied my city. By the way, I was born and lived all my life till that time in Częstochowa, Poland. It's the seat of the Black Madonna, which resides in a convent on top of a hill, a most beautiful area. And there's all kinds of histories and pilgrimages every year to that city, as Catholics believe in miracles that the Black Madonna is still performing today. We had a wonderful community in 1939. I frequented at school a private gymnasium, which is basically a high school. You start from first grade and finish. The name of my school was Dog House, because the original one was in a building looking like a dog house. So the one that they opened in 1937 was a palace of marble. So we only had 2 years in it before the war started. Things have started changing right from the first day. It is interesting that is so slowly everything was happening to us, then we didn't even realize, or maybe the elder people did. I, as a youngster, hardly felt the difference, because our teachers immediately organized classes. We had them in different homes. We had to walk more in different places, sometimes in their own apartments and ours and so on. And they were only more demanding from us now. There was no more soccer playing or gymnastics or anything else. So, but we spent more time learning. And because there was no other entertainment of any kind, we children really spent a lot of time on books. They kept us nourishing as much as they possibly can. But in the homes, there was a difference. Suddenly, there was no food. It was very hard to get any food at all. Even sometimes for money, you couldn't buy. You had to live on basic staples like vegetables, potatoes, and bread. That was basically the daily something. And everybody tried to make a meal out of that. It is interesting to notice, as a little by note in parentheses, that my father was under constant doctor's, how you call it, care, yes, care. He was going at least once a year to a kurort to drink waters, have massages and everything. Everything had to do with stomach. He unfortunately was too big, too fat. He ate too well before the war, and his body couldn't handle it. But in those days, if a steak wasn't fat, it wasn't a good steak. So what is there to say? And so on and so on. About a year into the war, on that new diet, I remember sitting at the table with just a soup there, and Dad turns to my mother and says, "You know, Helen, I'm not sick anymore. Everything is okay with me." And I remember that the last thing that just before the war, the doctor told him, and you laugh, that after every meal, he should lie down for 20 minutes on each side on the side to help the stomach to whatever. Obviously this didn't help, but a really forceful diet did. Suddenly he was not sick anymore. Well, in the meantime, while all this was happening in the first year, the Germans were bringing in new people all the time from all over around us, from all the small villages, from all the little towns. Wherever there were Jews living, they were being dropped in the middle of us and told the Jewish Gemeinde, or the ruling board of Jews, were responsible to do something with them. And I remember very well, we were going and collecting clothing and food and everything else, and they were allocating for them rooms and so on. That's what's going on. And also before the war, we were about a total of roughly 3,000 Jews in the city of close to 100,000. Suddenly we started growing. By the time they finished, by the time August of 1942, 1942 came around, there were more than 33 to 35,000 people there. And then, at one point, they suddenly pushed us into the oldest part of the city, and they called it the Little Ghetto. And we all ended up there. And now the Jewish board had to supply so many people to work whatever the Germans needed. Slave labor already began. considering that my father still had the aura of being sick and so on, and besides, he was by that time in the 40s, and I was a 15-year-old strapping boy, it was decided that I'll go, and I offered that. So I started working with shovels and gardens, digging ditches on the airport and so on, right from there till the time that I ended up in the concentration camp. It's interesting that the concentration camp was a factory, a textile factory of about 3,000 people working there before the war, owned by a family called Spalten. Jews, extremely rich. The Pavel Spalten, my best buddy, at least ahead, always higher than I was, we spent several weeks, 1 year, about a couple years before the war, building together a sleigh, a special sleigh, in that factory. That later on the Germans took everything out. They put in machinery to make bullets, and that's how it all started. We had no idea what was happening. By that time we were already completely isolated from the rest of the world, news and anything else. By 1942, the action started. This is very hard to describe for me. It was the most terrifying, soul-wrenching incident. We went to sleep like every day. Early in the morning, long before we were usually getting up, we heard shots constantly, screaming, shouting all over, people running in the street. And then the Germans barged in. Actually, I should say, paraphrase it, it wasn't the Germans that came in, it was SS men, Ukrainians that were, I don't know, volunteers or subscription to the German Death Brigade, if you want to call it that way. The first incident was my grandfather, my father's father, a tall, bearing himself like a king always before the war, and always I remember him. Also, he was nothing but a little, small, poor farmer. When the Germans came in to his apartment, and he lived on the ground floor, my father brought him in when he became 75 years old. His wife, my grandmother, died about 2 years before the war beginning. He was alone. When they came into his apartment, told him to run out, and with guns and everything in their hands and so on, screams and shoutings and terror all over, he folded his arms over his chest and says, "This is my house and I'm not going anywhere." He was shot right there. My father, we have built as a family a bunker. It was a hidden place with a faked wall where quite a few people were in it. We had by that time some ideas, really, stories that used to come from God knows where. We heard about concentration camps where they kill people by the millions, by the hundreds of thousands. We heard something like that about it, but we have never known. We didn't even have the names of the places. And we talked about bunkers because the idea is my father had so many friends, childhood friends, and literally in the woods, that he felt that if he can survive the action, he would be able to escape and maybe bring us out as well. And so it was a whole story. God knows what was possible, and no, we didn't know. I went out with my mother. We were terrified with other cousins and uncles and all around us. By the time we got into the street where they were mustering out with so many abreast to walk forward and so on, pushing with their bayonets and their rifles, shooting from time to time, and people screaming, children crying, the Germans, the Ukrainians screaming like hell, orders giving all the time. It was a pandemonium. It's very hard. I don't know if even Spielberg could design a scene like that I remember and that plagued me for most of my life. By the time we reached our destination, which was a big, huge plaza called the New Market, I found myself going to the left because people ahead of me were directed to the left and we followed, and then others were to the right. In the middle of the place, surrounded by, dozens of dogs, Germans were standing at the head, and they were pointing, looking at people and pointing to the left, to the right. We didn't know the meaning of that. I can tell you now that the ones that went to the left we never have seen again. They were all shipped to Treblinka, an extermination place. The one to the right survived, and they were all pushed, and there were very few of those, and all pushed, brought to the concentration camp called Pelzeri, which was in the factory of my friend's father. And here I was saved for the first time by some kind of an instinct or miracle, whatever you want. I was in the left. And I was by that time separated from my mother. I was separated from everybody. And as I looked to the right, I saw one of my cousins, an older one. He was probably in the 30s, starting going from the right line to the left line because his wife and 2 children were right in front of me, about 3 rows in front of me. He didn't know, obviously, he just wanted to be with the family. The meaning of right and left, he didn't know. Well, he made about 3-4 steps before they befell him. They started beating on him all over his head, body, with rifles. He fell to the ground, scratched his way across step by step while he was beating. He finally arrived to the feet of his wife, looked up at her, and that was his last breaths. He died right then and there. I was terrified. I've never seen anything like that. We never had a TV. We were not conditioned to that much of violence as today's kids are. And this was definitely not TV. The actors didn't get up afterwards. But I saw another cousin on the other side there, and I didn't want to be alone. Somehow, don't ask me how I did it, I went across and nobody stopped me. I just went slowly across and I went to the right side, and that was the first miracle because I survived. And there was nothing special about it. Nobody paid any attention to me. I just walked over, nothing else. There was nothing to hide. There wasn't a tree, a bush, or anything. And I just crossed over. We were taken on trucks, open trucks, delivered to the concentration camp, which was not far, dropped in a big shed, which was completely emptied with a concrete floor, no blankets, no nothing, no food, and dropped right there. It was very cold. Most of us in the middle of the night got up and tried to walk and exercise to keep warm, and everybody was hungry. That's how we ended up in the concentration camp. A new way of life started right then and there. Next morning, with tremendous efficiency, the Germans had it all organized. We found ourselves being brought to showers. We were supposed to wash ourselves, and then immediately we were taken to work. From that moment on till January 16th, 1945, I spent right there in that camp. I have become a foreman on three different type of machines, setting up the machines. That was a foreman. I had nothing to say except setting up the machines so we could continue, people there could continue to work, and the machine would not spew out some deficient shells. Basically, that's all I had to do. We lived in such abnormal way. For example, you always were hungry. And I don't mean this type of a hunger that you say today, kids say to a mother, "Mom, I am hungry," coming from school. No way. This was a hunger in the pit of your stomach that was with you day and night, was always with you. And you went to your barrack and you lay down to sleep and you were hungry. You got up in the morning in the middle of night, literally, it was dark, because they wanted us to muster and first, and then the Germans got like in an army and got the count whether anybody is missing and so on, and sometimes we stood in freezing weather for an hour or more, and you were hungry. You work your 12 hours a day, and you were all the time hungry. Even so they fed you. They gave you soup, which was water, and sometimes you found a piece of potato the size of an inch in it, and that was supposed to have been potato soup or something like that, or other vegetables. But that's about all, and we were hungry. Yes, we did get bread. Usually it was 3, 4, or 10 days old, black bread. We call it black, dark bread. And that was basically what we ate. There was no question of gaining weight or problems of diets. And then the horrible nights. The barrack contained probably, I don't know exactly, but several hundred people. And there were so many barracks there thrown. It was one thing was that even in the winter the barrack was warm. It wasn't cold because of the amount of people that were there in this place. We had platforms, 3 in height, one on the bottom, one in the middle, and one up high. People were lying next to each other. There was not much room. But that wasn't the worst. The worst part is kind of 2 hours later after you went to sleep. People started screaming in their dreams, calling names, waking up with tremor, with sweat all over their body. And there never was a silent moment. People imagined there all kinds going through tortures, shootings and things. And you listened to it. You learned how to listen and contain your own terror. Because I don't think that there was one person there, young or old, that could sleep without horrible dreams. Well, what is there to say about the work? You were glad to get up in the morning and go to work. At least you didn't have any dreams during the day. You were preoccupied with work. And then the incident arrived with my mother. My mother, I should have said it before, was with me in the camp. I didn't know about it, that she is alive till I saw her in the camp. I didn't know where she is. For the first 3 days, she was mourning me and I was mourning her, or missing. But then we found each other. She was in a woman's barrack. I was obviously in the men's barrack. And we found each other. My mother has never worked a day in her life. She was brought up, well, if I have to say in any ways, in a princely home. At my mother's house, which she lived in the same building with us, just below us on the second story, there was never less than 4 servants in her house. My mother had 2 sisters. I have still pictures of all of them. I brought them out of the war, believe it or not. They were with me. Here, I had them bound on me, and I carried them all the time I was in camp, and I came out with them. The first, oh my God, my leg fell asleep.
You want to stop it?
No, that's all right.
Because we're going to edit this.
Okay, yeah. Well, anyway, I'm probably running ahead of myself, but towards the end of 1944, we had 2 actions in the camp. 2 actions in the camp. From 3,000, some few hundred people that we were, each time they started taking away a few hundred and sending them to Germany. Later on, very few survived. I know they were sent to Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and Auschwitz, and so on. And we never saw them again. And one day I was notified that my mother was kept in one of the houses which the Germans used as a prison. They grabbed her, and they grabbed some other that they considered older woman or man or so on, and put them there because the transport, the railroad transport, was supposed to be by the end of the week, and they would put them all on it. That was the time when the Germans already decided that the war is probably lost. They wouldn't admit it, but they themselves, they had orders to liquidate the camp. So they started to liquidate the camp that way. Next morning, I got up earlier than everybody, and I wanted to see my mother. I had no idea what to do. I knew only one thing: I don't want to be separated from her again. And as I came close to the barrack, I saw that my mother is already at the window. She somehow knew that I would be there. And there was a guard at the very far right corner, which was quite far because the building was quite long. And she opened up the window. And I came in and I hugged her. The guard was on his way that way across the building, and then he had to come back, and I knew that because I observed that how he works. And I don't know what came over me. When Mother grabbed me and I grabbed her and we hugged, I literally lifted her up through the window and I started walking away. There wasn't a plan. It was in the spur of the moment. Something I just did without even thinking of anything. Now, by the time we were able to get away about 20, 30 feet, which was good enough, because already the place started populating itself with people coming from other barracks for the muster, the morning muster. It was half dark yet. So I took her to my barrack, and many months ago I was on top, being the youngest, they put me on top there, right underneath the ceiling, which was only a reach of my hand. I have loosened 3 boards, and I was keeping there all kinds, my photographs, of a piece of bread I was saving for later or something like that. I kept it over there. That's all I had. There was nothing else. I opened that up. I asked Mother to go in there. And I told her, I don't know what we're going to do, but we're going to do something. So hide in the meantime. Well, I was called about a midday to the German station, police station, if you want, or whatever, and interrogated. And I pretended I have not seen Mother and I have no idea where she is. They started searching all over the camp. All the camp already knew about it, everybody, and they didn't find her. They were the group of people that were sent to Germany went away, and the German foreman came to talk to me. His name was Stiglitz, a little small, tiny man, and he was not in uniform. He was in civilian usually. He was a technician of some kind, and he asked me, if you bring the Mother out wherever she is, We'll just let her work. What else were we going to do with her? I somehow couldn't believe him. But after about 10 days up there, and me trying to feed her and all that, and I don't want to talk about anything else on this subject here, I decided might as well, because whatever happens, I told Mother, if they take you or do anything, I'll go with you. We go both together. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen. Well, I took her out, and lo and behold, he kept his word. He put her to work. And that's how we survived till January 16th, 1945, and we were liberated by the Russians. But there is so much that should have been the end of the story, but really it isn't. On about 2 weeks after liberation, a friend of mine came and asked me to be a witness that he lived and that his family owned the house before the war. I was in this house with him for hundreds of times. I said, sure. Next week when I came into the place where there was the hearing about that, there were 3 Russians there in uniform conducting the hearing. And when my time came in to be interrogated, they asked me of my name, obviously, and then say, who was your father? What did he do? And like a little idiot, I told them the truth. And the guy called me immediately a bourgeois. And 2 minutes later, he gave me a little piece of paper with the address to come to his office. I think it was on a Wednesday. When I came home and told that to my mother and other old elders, they were quite worried, because they said they'll take you and put you in a Russian school somewhere in Siberia or somewhere in Russia to educate you, to make a good communist out of you. This is when I decided I don't want to stay anymore in Poland anyway. I packed my little rucksack with 2 shirts I think I had, and some socks, some underwear, and I went. I had no money. And I wanted to go to Italy. Why Italy? Because my father's partner's son spent a lot of time in Italy before the war, and I used to listen to his stories about Italy and so on, and I was really kind of dreaming about it. Partly by walking, partly by railroad, and I got to Italy in May, when the war was still going on in Germany, but in Italy it was all finished already. Well, a miracle happened there, because I found my father's dear friend that was living there from before the war, and he arranged for me, because I wanted to go to school immediately. I lost all those years of schooling. I obviously didn't speak Italian. Well, he arranged for me to join Italian high school. I could go, I was told, as an observer, but obviously I couldn't be a student. I didn't understand the word in Italian yet. So I started learning Italian day and night. I immersed myself in that. After about a short while, they took me with acute anemia. I couldn't get off the bed. They took me to the hospital. They gave me injections that were based on serums that were based on horse's blood, and they were about that big. I don't remember what they were. And as the doctors and all, everybody spoke Italian. By that time I started talking a little bit, but I still didn't understand that very well. Well, I finished high school. I passed the exams, and then I went and was able to get into what I really wanted since I was 10 years old. I went to the Naval Academy. I finished there. I got the second diploma, and the best diploma, the first diploma in Italian language. Also, I took with 36 Italians the examinations. The days after the war, you asked about that. How did you live? Well, I can only speak for myself. The nights were the worst, but the fact that I was young, the fact that I had a goal which I wanted with all my heart, with everything that I could in my body and soul, made it possibly the days passable, but not the nights, not the evenings when you were alone. As I was saying to you, my pillow was most of the time wet with my tears. I had a fight with God. I could not understand why innocent children died so miserably, and I was alive. Let me give you a little incident. My uncle, which lived right across the hall from me, had 2 children, 2 girls. We were playing together. I was older, I was the big, I don't know, brother or whatever. When I was coming from school, they usually was sitting on the steps waiting for me. When I was doing my homework, which that was sacred, they were sitting both on 2 chairs across the table on the other side, and not even a peep, waiting so I could play with them after I finished my homework. The rule in the house was, and that was with everybody, you couldn't go leave the house even or do anything till your homework was finished, and my mother would check it. And the older one was a raving beauty, and she was only like about 4 or 5 years old. She was a raving beauty. My uncle, in the first months when we were right after the action that I told you about, that took us from our homes and turned us left and right. He was put to work driving in a wagon, and they were going from home to home, taking all the furniture and everything else that was in every house or apartment and put it and delivering it to a warehouse where it was segregated and do whatever the Germans did with it. That was his job at that time. One day as he was passing the streets, the little girl, which he was mourning already, she was on the second story in a window. She opened the window and screamed exactly the words, "Daddy, Daddy, they want to kill me." 5-year-old. You understood that. Well, he never could do anything. We have never seen the little girl again. And her sister, what I didn't fill you out, we were, I told you, in the little ghetto. In that little ghetto, when they finally took us out from that little ghetto and they took us to Pelzeri, the concentration camp, they dynamited every house there because they suspected, and rightfully so, that there were partisans there. Except that my grandmother and that little kid together were in a bunker there. They were blown up. Let me tell you about my grandmother. She was not the average woman. She was like a queen. Her husband and my grandfather died in the 20s. I think it was 20 or 21, 1920 or 1921, before I was born. He went out on his second-story balcony facing the street, as he usually used to do that. And right across the street, there was a bunch of Polish nationalists putting an older Jew's bird on fire. They were the ones that used to stage the pogroms and so on. My grandfather, an extremely religious man, went back into the house, lay down on his bed, and never got up again. He died in that bed about a year later. During that time also they had 4 servants in the house, minimum. Sometimes there were 6 and 7. My mother was chosen by Grandma, by her mother, to take care of father. Nobody else could do but his own daughter. And that created a schism between Grandma and my mother, because my mother always, to the rest of her life, could not forgive mother for taking her out from school and making her sit there with daddy there, which basically by that time was vegetating. But this Grandma, every Saturday she would come from the temple, open up the Gemara, a book about that size. She would read it in Hebrew, translate it into Yiddish with voice, talk to herself and argue with the philosophers in the book or the point of view in the book or so on. Her belief in God, in people, in honesty, well, that permeated my total upbringing, and definitely affected everybody else. That was Grandma. She was blown up with a little child, I can imagine, in her arms. Yes. My dad, they discovered that banker, that he was hidden. And I have never knew what happened. But one day I was working in a German officer's garden, and they brought in some more people, and I saw two people talking, and one of them pointing at me directly. That same moment I had no reason to believe that I knew that my dad is dead. So I went over to the guy, the new one that came over, and I was telling the story to the other guy. And I asked him, why were you pointing on me? Oh, he was a Polish guy, and he says to me, oh, I was just telling this guy that your dad was shot. I knew him, just like that. He's in a mass grave in our city. Well, going back to how I survived after the war. Well, I remember it still today. As you can see, everything I'm saying is not from a script. Everything is chiseled on my brain. There's a million incidences, things that happened, how it happened. I even was sick in the camp with, oh God, not diphtheria.
Dysentery.
No, worse than that. Typhus. The word didn't come to me. People, all they did is create a room with tables, and they put people on tables. There was no beds. And they put us, a doctor by the name of Dr. Sperling, and I'll tell you about him, was treating them without any medicine, non-medicine of any. All he could do is come, and if you were burning with fevers, put some cold water on you, or a handkerchief with cold water, that's it. People on the right here were taken away the first day, then the left from there they were taken dead the second day, and I was half time I was out of my mind. I was asleep, I didn't know, but I was waking up, and for a moment I was lucid. I saw everybody was dying around me. I survived. One day, a Polish co-worker I bought from him a little piece of butter. He had literally scraped it off his sandwich. Somebody saw it. I was taken to the guardhouse. I was put across the bathtub, down, and two SS men, each on each side of me, with rubber hoses, didn't stop hitting as hard as they could till they couldn't anymore, till they were tired. Well, I was black and blue, and I lived with that for quite a few weeks before I could even feel that I am normal again. And so on and so on and so on. There is a million things that you could say, but the worst thing is And I don't know how to touch it. I wish I could answer it. I wish I could answer it. I wish it would be clear. When did I forgive God? Me forgiving God. I was 50 odd years old. During all that time, I worked very, very hard. I became an officer in the Israeli Navy. I helped build, well, I was first in the Israeli army. I was in the war in 1947. A little incident. In 1947, during vacation time, I went to Germany, where my mother was at that time, waiting for her visa to United States. A friend of mine, school friend of mine, which I was happy to, took me to a meeting where people from the Bericha in Israel were looking for soldiers to fight the war in Israel. The 47, the first war, 48, we became a nation. I went, and I was fired up with that. So I came home and talked with Mother, and I said I would like to go to Israel and join the army. Well, the moment I said to my mother the moment she heard that, she came up with so much tears and screams. We had to survive the war and lose everything, so for me to send you now to a war? She was not a Zionist, neither was I. She went into a room, closed the door. She didn't want to talk to me. Next morning she came out. She hugged me. And she blessed me and she sent me out to war. How she could do it, I'll never understand it. How much nobility do you have to have? Her only son. The whole family was right there in me. A way of life she only knew. I represented it. I was the future. She sent me to war. And she loved me with all her heart. I went and I joined the army, and I saw Israel, and then in 1948 I was called in to my officer. He had my diploma and my papers from the Naval Academy. And he says, "You're some kind of a captain? A sea captain?" And I say, "Yes." "Well, here are your papers. Go to Haifa." They kept me in Haifa for 3 weeks before we had the first ship. I was in a motel. And that was Shoham. Shoham was the first naval or merchant marine company in Israel. There's many now, but there was nothing else. That was the first one. And I only had to go about, oh, I was on most of the ships that brought the DPs, so to say, from Europe. I took them out by the hundreds and hundreds, from Italy, from Marseille, from Germany. I took the first Yemenite out and brought them to Israel. I took even the Jews which you saw in the Exodus movie in Cyprus, from Cyprus. We had a ship at that time, Negba, which could accommodate maybe 600 people atop. We had 2,000 plus on the ship for the trip to Israel. It's true, it's a short trip, but they were sitting and sleeping right on the steel in the corridors, on deck, everywhere. I sailed with the real captain of the Exodus, Aronovich, for 2 years. I was his second mate, then I was his chief mate. We were in Russia together even. And then one day in 1956, things were, my mother by that time obviously was in United States. She was sick, she didn't feel good, she had trouble with her eyes, couldn't work. And I could not help her because my salary as chief mate of an Israeli ship, I was getting $75 American money, so I could spend on the outside, and the rest Israeli was hopeless. I could do nothing with that. So there was not very much I could help. So I decided I have to come to United States and help my mother. That ended my career. I came and they told me that I cannot stay in United States because, a lawyer told me, because my Polish quota was closed. So to make the story short, he told me to go to Canada, gave me an address of a fellow in Canada, which I went to, and he immediately took me actually and notified the immigration in Canada of me being there, and they permit me to have a temporary visa and work. Well, from there, this is all history. A year and a half later, I opened up my own business, and I haven't stopped since. I have never worked for anybody in all the years. I was always had my own company, and I did help. I brought my mother to Canada, bought her a house. She spent a few years in the house, went for a trip to Israel, and she loved Israel so much, she sold the house and went to Israel to live. And she didn't come home till one day she called me, "Come and take me home," she said. So I went to Israel and I brought her home. There is a million things that I could say and still not have the answer that everybody would like to know. Most of all me, how I did it, how I lived with myself. It's very hard. And today, I always think of myself not as Raphael, which is my Hebrew name, first name, but as Jacob. Because all my life I seemed to struggle with God. And I was not very pleasant to him. I argued with him. So I guess he decided differently because today I am a rabbi. A lay rabbi, true, but a rabbi. Has anybody got any questions?
Did you have any family? You have a wife, or
Yes.
you might tell them, about your wife, and do you have any children? What they do?
Yes. I married a girl with 2 children at very late age in my life. I did not want to get married. You're forgetting all the children and all my little cousins and all that were always in my mind. I live with that. And between other things, it might happen again. I was always afraid of that. As a matter of fact, I went to a school in which many schools I speak across here about the Holocaust to the children, and I was in the 7th grade in Orange County. Port Orange, Port Orange. And a young fellow came over to me and says, I remember you from a couple years ago, he says, and your words, never again, are still with me. And he says, you warned us that it can happen anywhere in the world, including here in America. And he says, September 11. How did you know? I said, I didn't know. I didn't know. I just hoped it will never happen.
Thank you.
I didn't tell you. I married with a girl that was married previously. She had 2 children. We raised them. They're both doing fantastic. One has his own business and is doing very well. The other one is, he works for Washington Mutual. He's basically, we had a lot of problems with him. He turned out a fantastic guy. He is now building communication for such companies as Washington Mutual. He was previously with Schwab, Charles Schwab, and many international and national communication between all their branches, all their computers and everything else. He's doing very well as well. As a matter of fact, he was here last week.
Well, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
Thanks a lot.